They told her the iron crest was dead metal, a thing to be rubbed and forgotten, the way they had decided she was. 8 winters she had knelt before it with rag and ash, while the great ones of the keep stepped over her as though she were a stain worn into the floor. The steward said the bloodline was finished, and the world had moved past it. The elders said the old king was as good as buried, and best left so. The girl with the burned hand and the borrowed name kept polishing, because polishing was the one thing left that no one had thought worth taking from her. She did not know that the light sleeping inside that cold black iron had been waiting 180 years for a particular hand to come and wake it. She did not know that when it finally woke, every proud knee in that frozen hall would be taught to bend. You should know it now, though, before the frost ever touches the story, so that when the crest at last answers her, you feel the full weight of how long it had kept its silence, and how much it had cost to keep. In the year 1422, the snow came early and stayed late, and the great keep above the Vale of Carrow froze from its deep cellars to its banner poles. Wren had lived inside its lower hall since she was 9, since the night the soldiers came with torches and took her father out into the dark and brought back, by morning, only his boots set neat by the gate as a lesson to the Vale. She was 19 now, narrow and quiet, with a watchful stillness people mistook for slowness. Her left hand was seamed wrist to fingertip with an old burn that the deep cold made ache, and she kept it gloved and out of sight, because the keep flinched from the sight of it, and a flinch was one more thing she could not afford. She rose before the bells and slept after the last brazier died, and in the long, frozen hours between she kept the relics of the dead royal house, the dented goblets and the rusted spurs and the crest above all. It hung on the cold stone of the vigil hall, a disk of black iron the height of her chest, carved with a running wolf and a ring of worn marks no living elder could read. The keep called it the Sleeping Crest. They said it had blazed gold once, in the old king's grandfather's day, and gone black and silent forever, the night the true northern line failed and the keep changed hands. Now it was only a chore, and the chore was hers. Steward Carmot ruled the keep in the name of a king no one had seen in 2 years. He was a broad, smooth man with a ring on every finger and a voice that filled a room without seeming to lift, and he liked to walk the length of the vigil hall when the court gathered, because the cold and the relics reminded the highborn whose hand now held every key. He came upon Wren there one gray morning, on her knees with the ashcloth working the iron in slow sunwise rings, and he stopped, and the dozen lords trailing him stopped with him. "Still at your idol, girl," Carmot said, pitching it to carry the length of the hall. 8 years on your knees rubbing a corpse bright. They should have left you in the snow with your traitor father and saved the bread. The hall gave the small, careful laugh of people laughing because the powerful man had. Wren did not lift her eyes from the iron. She had learned, very young, that her face was a thing they liked to feed on, the catch of breath, the wet eye, and she had taught herself to give them a smooth nothing. She set the cloth flat and drew it down the wolf's carved flank the way she always did, sunwise, unhurried, and she said, low and even, in 2 clauses, "He kept the watchfires lit through every storm. That is not the work of traitors." Carmot's smile thinned at the edges. A lord at his shoulder murmured that the steward ought not spend his breath on a kennel girl, and the court swept on toward the warm rooms and the morning wine, and Wren was left alone again with the cold and the black iron and the ring of marks she had touched 10,000 times and never once been able to read. If you have ever been the one left kneeling on the stone while the warm rooms fill with everyone who matters, stay close to this one, because the kneeling is not where it ends. She had one friend in that frozen place, and the friend was old. Bet had kept the relics before Wren for 40 years, until her knees gave out on the cellar stair one autumn, and the steward decided a younger back was cheaper than a healer. Now she sat by the relic room hearth in a nest of old wool and sorted candle ends into the tin that paid for her salt, and she told the girl things no one else in the keep would say aloud. It was Bet who had taught her the crest must be cleaned in rings, always sunwise, never across, out of a respect whose reason the old woman swore she had forgotten, and whose loss seemed to grieve her more than her ruined knees. It was Bet who, when Wren was 9 and newly motherless and weeping into the ash bucket for a father whose boots had come home without him, had pressed a hard heel of barley bread into her good hand and held the burned one without flinching, and said, "The keep forgets nothing and forgives slowly, and you will outlast it if you stay quiet and keep your hands busy." Wren had believed her. Wren had stayed quiet for 10 years, and her hands had never once been still. There was another friend too, though Wren would not have dared to call the great dark thing a friend. A wolf had begun coming to the postern gap that autumn, where the wall had cracked in an old frost and never been mended. It was a black wolf bigger than any hound in the kennels, bigger than seemed right, with a chest like a barrel and eyes that caught the torchlight and threw it back amber. The guards on the wall threw stones at it and missed, and cursed it for an omen, and made the warding sign. Wren did none of those things. She had little enough of her own, a thin supper of broth and the gristle the kitchen would not serve the lords, and she began leaving the gristle on the flat stone by the gap, telling herself it was only to keep the beast from the kennels. The wolf never touched the meat while she watched. It watched her instead, with a patience that crawled along her spine, and one frozen evening when she had lingered too long it came close enough that she could have run and did not, and she put out her burned left hand the way she never did to people, and the wolf lowered its great head and breathed against the scarred skin, slow and deliberate, and did not flinch from it the way the keep flinched from it. Something in the way it looked at her was not the way an animal looks at a thing that feeds it. She told herself she imagined that, the way she told herself a great many things in those years, and went in out of the cold. The trouble began the night the southern lords arrived under Carmot's invitation, their sleds heavy with iron-bound chests, and their banners the color of old blood hung from the gatehouse where the northern wolf had once flown. Wren carried wine that night because 2 of the kitchen girls had taken fever, and so she was in the great hall, moving along the walls with a jug too heavy for her bound-up arm, when Carmot rose at the high table and rang his knife against his cup until the hall fell quiet. He told the court that the old king, the lost Alpha King Dav of the northern line, the king the keep had mourned and the south had cursed, had been found. Found, he said, not freed, not rescued, not returned. The word sat wrong in the warm, wine-thick air, and Wren felt it sit wrong, though she could not yet say why. He said the king had been taken in a far northern pass 2 winters gone, gravely poisoned by his own treacherous pack, near death when loyal hands brought him here, and that the keep had labored these long months to heal a man too far broken to be healed. He said that on the coming frost vigil, the oldest sacred night the veil kept, the court would witness a severing, the ancient rite that cut a ruined king from his crown and his crest, so that a stronger and steadier hand might take them up cleanly, for the good of all the packs. He smiled when he said stronger hand, and the rings flashed on his fingers, and the southern alphas raised their cups to him. Wren set down the wine jug on a side table because her hands had begun to shake, and she felt the floor tilt very slightly under her, the way a frozen pond ticks once, deep, before it gives. She did not know the man in the cellar yet. She knew only that a king who had been healed was not chained in smoke beneath the garrison, and that a steward who spoke of mercy did not smile when he said stronger hand, and that the word found was the word a man used for a thing he had buried and meant to dig up only to bury again deeper. She carried these things down with her when the feast ended, the way she carried everything down, into the cold, where the relics waited and no one watched her think. She found the king 3 nights later, by accident, because the relic cellars ran beneath the old garrison along a passage most of the keep had forgotten, and she had gone down for the lamp oil kept in the far store. Behind a grate of cold black bars in a cell that stank of green silver-leaf smoke and old sickness, a man sat against the far wall with his wrists in heavy manacles that smoked faintly where the metal touched his skin. He was big, even ruined, dark-haired, a beard grown wild down his throat, a long old scar dragging one brow out of true. His chest was bare to the cold and marked with the silvered wheals of a wound that should have killed him and a poison that would not let it close. His eyes, when they dragged open at the sound of her, were the amber of the wolf at the gate, and the shock of that went through her before her mind could name it. He looked at her without hope and without fear, the way a man looks who has decided the worst of it is already decided and only the waiting remains. "Go up, girl," he said, and his voice was the wreck of something that had once filled halls. "There is nothing down here worth your hide." Wren should have gone up. Every law of the keep said go up. The silver leaf in the air alone could fell a working wolf, and the manacles were the kind that did not let a great power heal. She stayed. She had spent her life among things the keep had decided were dead, and she had learned to doubt that verdict. She came back the next night with clean water and a salve bet kept for burns, and she reached through the bars and turned his ruined wrist toward the lamp to see where the silver had eaten in. The instant her fingers closed on his skin, a heat went up her arm that had no rational name, a pull deep in her chest like a hook set behind the breastbone, and a single word rose in her without sound, a word she did not own and could not say. She let go as though the iron had burned her. She told herself it was the cold and the fear and the long day. She told herself that the whole way up the stair, and she did not believe it even as she said it. She went back. That was the shape of the next weeks. The going back. Down the forgotten passage with water and salve hidden under her apron. She told herself it was mercy. The same plain mercy she gave the wolf at the gate, and the half-frozen cats in the granary, and the lie held in daylight and thin to nothing at night. She learned, in pieces, between his long silences, that his name was Dav, and that he had been king of the northern packs before Carmot's faction put Silverleaf in his cup at a parley table and sold the South the story that he had abandoned his people in the night. She learned that Silverleaf, brewed green and breathed in the closed air of a cell, kept a wolf from shifting and a great wound from healing, and that Halgar's men dosed the cell at each dawn from the brazier in the passage to keep their king a weak and mortal man. She learned that he had stopped counting the days at 400 and had started again twice and stopped again. He spoke little and watched much. When she cleaned the silver burns at his wrists, he held himself so rigidly still that the chain did not so much as whisper, and she understood after a time that the stillness cost him, that a man used to filling halls had taught himself to take up no more room than a stone so as to give his captors nothing. One night her scarred hand passed near his jaw as she reached for the far manacle, and he turned his face a bare fraction toward it, toward the burn, the way the wolf had lowered its head to her palm, and then he stopped himself with a sharp breath and went rigid again. The stopping was louder than any word he had spoken. She felt the held look settle on the back of her neck after she had turned away to rinse the cloth, a weight with heat in it, and she did not turn back. And she could not have said whether it was fear or something with the same fast pulse as fear that kept her facing the wall. She lay awake on her pallet that night with her heart going like a trapped bird against her ribs, and the burned hand pressed over it as if to keep it in, and she told herself a great many things, and believed none of them. Another night he asked her name. Not ordered, asked when he could have called her girl forever, and she would have answered. She told him, and he said it once back to her, low, testing the shape of it, and the single sound of it in his ruined voice went through her like the heat had gone up her arm that first night. She gathered her things too quickly and left, and on the stair she stood a long moment in the dark with her hand flat on the cold stone, breathing, before she trusted her legs to carry her up. The last night before the sleet, she had stayed past the safe hour because he had begun, haltingly, to speak of the north as it had been, the high cold pastures and the watchfires lit along the ridgelines on feast nights, and she had realized with a lurch that her own father's small fires in the vale had been the southern end of that same chain of light, lit for a king she had never known she served. He had stopped mid-sentence and looked at her through the bars, close, the green smoke thin between them, and neither of them had spoken, and the wanting in the cell had been a third presence with its own weight and its own heat, and she had understood that if she stayed one breath longer, something would happen that could not be unmade. She had made herself rise. She had made herself climb the stair. She had lain awake again, with her burned hand pressed to her mouth, where the shape of his name kept trying to form. Up in the warm rooms the trap kept tightening, and Wren caught its edges the way a servant catches everything, in passing, behind doors, while pouring. She heard Carmot tell a southern lord that once the severing cut the old king from the crest itself would be carried to the forge and melted to a slag cake, the last hard proof of the northern line unmade so that no future claimant could ever wake it. She heard him say that the king's own beta, a scarred warrior named Halgar who had stood at Dav's shoulder 20 years, had been the hand that carried the poisoned cup, bought with the promise of his own small holding, and now guarded the cell so that no loyal soul could reach it. She heard a number that lodged in her like a splinter under a nail. For 8 years she had knelt to dead iron and been counted nothing, stepped over, named a stain. The court that would gather for the severing, Carmot said, would number 400 souls, every lord of the Vale and the southern packs besides, 400 witnesses assembled to watch the last northern king cut from his name forever. She carried that number down the cellar stair with the salve and the water, and she did not know yet that the same 400 would be made, before the moon set, to learn hers. If you have ever counted the people who looked through you, stay until the count comes due. The cost came due on a night of hard sleet that hissed against the high windows like a thing trying to get in. Wren had ground a paste of marrow root and cellar ash, an old remedy Bet swore drew poison up out of a wound, the way a poultice drew a splinter, and she was working it into the silver burns on Dav's wrist through the bars, her sleeves pushed up, and her own burned hand steadying his, when Boots came down the forgotten stair, slow and certain. She had time only to press flat into the black of the alcove behind the oil store and stop her own breathing. It was Halgar. She knew him by his bulk and the long warrior's tread, the turned beta come to set the dawn dose hours early. He stopped at the bars. He saw the wet salve gleaming fresh on the king's wrist, saw the bandaged linen she had left, and he understood in one breath that some hand had been tending what the steward had ordered left to rot. He did not raise the alarm. He drew a thin flat knife from his belt and said, almost gently, that the king would simply be found dead of his old poisoning a day before the rite, that it was cleaner so, no rite needed, no claimant possible, and he reached for the lock. Wren came out of the dark because there was no one else in the world to come. She crossed the floor and put herself between the knife and the bars before she had decided to, her arms out, her back to the king she could not save by any sane reckoning. The blade was already moving and it opened her forearm from wrist to elbow, a bright cold line that went hot a heartbeat later, and she heard the drops of her own blood strike the stone, but she did not scream, and she did not fall. She set her good hand hard over the wound to keep it in, and she kept her feet. And into the terrible ringing after the blow she said, in 2 clauses, low and clear, "You carried his cup. He knows your face in it. Killing me does not unspill what you poured." Halgar went still. The knife hung in the air between them. Something crossed his hard-scarred face, a flinch, the first crack in 2 years of bought obedience, the look of a man hearing his own crime named aloud by someone bleeding for the thing he betrayed. He looked past her at the king he had sold, who was on his feet now against the chain, with his amber eyes blown wide and his still hands shaking for the first time since she had known them. And he looked back at the small girl with the old burn and the new wound, who would not move out of his way. He lowered the knife. He turned without a word and went back up the stair, and the dark swallowed his tread, and Wren did not understand yet that she had just pried open the door her whole salvation would walk through. Dav reached through the bars then and pressed his manacled hand flat over the gash on her arm, his blood from the silver burns and her blood, and the green smoke all running together under his palm, and he held it there, holding her wound closed with the only strength they had left him, and he said only her name. Not get up. Not why did you? Not foolish girl. Her name, once, the way he had said it that other night, as though he had been saying it silently inside that cell for weeks, and the sight of her bleeding had finally torn it loose. Wren felt the hook behind her breastbone pull so hard she had to grip the cold bars to keep standing. She did not pull away this time. She stood in the freezing dark with a chained king's hand sealing her arm, and a heat rising off his bare chest that the silver leaf by every law should have smothered, and his breath at the bars warm on her cold face, and for one long breath she let herself want what a kennel girl had no right to want, the whole of it, all at once, with her heart slamming and his name in her own mouth unsaid. Then the dawn bell tolled far above them, and the spell of it broke, and she fled up the stair with her sleeve gone dark to the cuff, and his palm heat still printed on her arm. She bound the arm herself in the dark of the relic room, and told the kitchen she had caught it on a nail-hauling crates. She had perhaps 4 days until the vigil. Bet found the truth in her face the way Bet found everything, and did not scold and did not ask how. The old woman sat very still by her candle ends for a long while, her ruined hands folded, and then she said the thing she had carried, folded inside her for 40 years. She had been a girl in this keep when the crest still glowed, she said, a maid to the last true queen of the northern line, before the poison and the broken parley and the night the keep changed hands. That queen had borne a daughter in the deep of that same winter the line fell, and had given the child away within the hour, smuggled out a postern in a market basket to a loyal watchfire family down in the Vale, to be raised under a borrowed name with no knowledge of her blood, so that the new powers could not find the child and stamp the line out as they had stamped out everything else. A watchfire family. Wren sat with the cold coming up through the floorboards into her bones. Her father had kept the watchfires of the Vale. Her father had died for keeping them lit. Bet reached out and took the burned left hand, the one the whole keep flinched from, and turned the scarred palm to the candle. And there, beneath the old ruined skin Wren had hidden under a glove for 8 years, faint as breath fogging a cold pain, ran a thin thread of pale light that Wren had spent those 8 years rubbing into iron, and had never once thought to look for on her own flesh. The crest is cleaned in rings, always sunwise, never across, Bet said, her voice shaking, because it was never an idol and never a chore. It was a lock. It read the blood of the hand that tended it. The old queen had told her so once, and it had been tended for 180 years by the hands of stewards and servants who were not the blood, and so it had slept, refusing them all, waiting for the one hand that was. They had set the true heir to scrub the very thing that would have named her, and laughed while she did it, and never once guessed. Wren did not sleep that night, nor the next. On the third night, in the black hours when the braziers were cold embers and the 400 had not yet begun to arrive, she went up alone to the vigil hall. The great disk of black iron hung where it had always hung, the running wolf and the ring of unreadable marks she knew better than her own sleeping face. She stood before it a long time with her heart going. Then she peeled the glove from her left hand, and she put out the burned palm the way she had 10,000 mornings, but slowly now, and afraid, and she laid the scarred skin flat against the carved flank of the wolf. The marks she had never been able to read warmed under her hand. A line of gold woke deep in the iron and ran out along the carved channels. The way fire runs along spilled oil, ran the wolf and the ring, and out to the very rim of the disk. And the dead crest of the northern kings blazed full gold in the dark and silent hall for the first time in 180 years. The light of it lit her stunned face from below, gold on the tracks of tears she had not known she was shedding, and at last, kneeling to no one, she understood the whole shape of what she had been kneeling to. The frost vigil came with the whole court packed shoulder to shoulder into the vigil hall under a moon the winter had cracked across with cloud. 400 souls, robed elders of the Vale and armored southern alphas under their banners the color of old blood. Every face lit orange by the wall braziers. On the high dais stood Carmot in a fur the color of fresh snow, and beside him a tall brazier heaped with green silverleaf, so its smoke would keep any wolf in the room from rising, and chained at the very foot of the dais where all could see knelt the ruined king, dragged up from the cellar to be severed before they bore his crest to the forge. Wren stood in the servant's dark at the side with the ash cloth still in her apron, her bound arm aching in the cold, and watched Carmot lift the long right blade and name the northern line broken and the old king nothing, a husk, a cautionary thing. Then the steward asked, because the ancient rite demanded the question be asked, whether any blood of the northern house stood in the hall to claim the crown and the crest, and he asked it into the smiling certainty of 180 years of silence. Wren walked out of the dark into the center of the hall. She had no gown and no rank, and her wounded arm was bound under a borrowed sleeve, and 400 faces turned to look at the kennel girl with the burned hand as though a hearthstone had stood up and spoken. Carmot laughed first, and the hall began to take up the laugh behind him the way it always had, and he said, for what he believed was the last time, the thing he had been saying for 8 years, that she was nothing, a stain on the floor, a traitor's whelp who should have frozen in the snow with her father. Wren did not answer him with her mouth. She crossed the flagstones to the wall where the crest hung in its iron, and she peeled the glove from her left hand before them all, and she laid her scarred palm flat against the running wolf. The gold woke in the iron and ran the channels and blazed up bright enough to throw her shadow huge across the vaulted ceiling, and the laughter died in 400 throats between one breath and the next. The green flame in the brazier guttered as if a door had opened on a storm. Far off, beyond the frozen walls, a wolf threw its long voice up at the broken moon, and a second answered, and a third, until the whole night outside the keep was one rising howl. The gate did not open. The gate broke. The iron-banded doors of the vigil hall burst inward off their hinges in a gout of splintered oak and frozen air, and through the wreck of them came the black wolf of the postern gap, vast now and whole, the silver leaf gone from his blood, his amber eyes the only warm thing in all that cold hall, and at his flank a hard wedge of northern warriors who had never once stopped searching for their king. The night wind poured through the broken doors and blew the green smoke out of the hall in a long ribbon, and the man chained at the foot of the dais lifted his head as the poison thinned, and drew one full breath, and came up off his knees with the manacles snapping from his wrists like rotten thread. The aura that rolled off him as he rose put the southern alphas down onto the flagstones whether their pride willed it or not, knees cracking against stone the length of the hall. Halgar came through the broken gate at the head of the loyal guard with his thin knife turned the other way now. The crack in the cellar opened all the way into return. The avoided blow made good at last. Wren stood with her palm still flat on the burning crest, while the king crossed the hall to her through the kneeling lords, and he did not loom, and he did not hurry. He stopped an arm's length before her, this man the whole world named the most powerful living thing, and he looked at the small woman with the scarred hand and the bound arm who had come down a forgotten stair, when no other soul in the keep would, and slowly, deliberately, before 400 witnesses, he lowered himself onto one knee on the cold flagstones. A king on his knee to a kennel girl. The hall made no sound at all. "I will kneel to no crown that is not in your hand," Dav said, and his voice had come back whole, and it filled the hall the way it had been made to. He reached up and took her burned hand down off the iron and turned it palm upward, where the thread of pale light ran clear and bright now for the whole court to read, the proof they had set her to scrubbing for 8 years, and he bent his head and pressed his mouth to the old scar she had hidden her whole life under a glove. And the hall that had counted her nothing went down knee by knee around the two of them, lord after elder, like a field of standing grass going flat under the first heavy snow. Carmot did not kneel. He saw his whole life going down with the lords around him, and he lunged, for the right blade and for the burning crest both, to cut the air or seize the iron. It did not matter which, only that he reach it first. The crest flared white as bone as Wren's scarred hand closed against it, and the severing he had built, the false right tuned to cut a true king from his crown, found instead the throat of the man who had poisoned one. The bond magic he had bent and sharpened for treachery snapped back along its own length into his own chest like a bowstring loosed, and he was dead on the flagstones before the nearest southern lord had finished rising from his knee. It was quick. It was no more than the weight of his own work returning to him, and the hall did not mourn it, and Wren did not gloat. She only lowered her shaking hand from the white-hot iron. The hidden hands behind him, the southern alphas who had hauled the blood-red banners and the iron chests up the vale to buy a kingdom cheap, knelt now with all the rest and named her of the northern line their queen, because 400 witnesses had watched dead iron wake to the touch of her blood, and there was no other story left in the world to tell. The crest of the kings burned steady gold above them all, and this time it did not go dark. They crowned her on the first clear morning the vale had seen in a season, in the same hall, before the same court, beneath the same iron that had named her. Old Bet stood at the very front, in the place where the lords had stepped over her for 40 years, and she wept, and no one stepped over her, and a chair was brought for her ruined knees. The southern packs went home under banners no longer the color of blood. Halgar took the long, hard road north alone, to carry the king's living name back to the people who had been told for 2 winters that he had abandoned them, his penance, and his choosing both. Dav gave up the throne he could have taken that night by force, and the crown the right would have handed him, and took instead the one she set in his hands with her own. And when the chronicles of the northern house were written out fresh, the scribes set down that the line had never truly broken, only slept, only waited 180 years for a quiet hand the powerful had trained themselves not to see. Wren still went up to the vigil hall sometimes in the black hours before the bells, out of a habit 8 years deep, with the ash cloth in her good hand. The great black wolf walked at her heel wherever she went now, through the warm rooms and the cold ones alike, and he lay himself down across the flagstones at her feet while she worked, his amber eyes half closing in the dark. She cleaned the crest in slow rings, always sunwise, never across, the way Bet had taught her, the way the blood had remembered when the mind could not. Under her bare scarred palm the gold light woke and held. At her feet the great wolf slept, and the iron, which had been cold under that hand for 8 years and dark for 180, was warm.